They said the children were safe there, that behind those brick walls under the watch of God no harm could touch them. But the walls were never built to keep evil out. They were built to keep the truth in. In the fall of 1893, in a quiet southern town few could point to on a map, an orphanage was praised as the jewel of Christian charity. Newspapers wrote of its devotion, the way it sheltered abandoned children from hunger, from sin, from the cruelty of the outside world. But what the town saw, the neat rows of pews, the hymns sung by trembling young voices, the carefully polished smiles of its leaders, was only a mask. Late at night, mothers in the countryside whispered of missing children who were never reported. Parishioners swore they saw lights burning in the basement windows when all should have been dark. And those who dared to question why so many little graves appeared behind the chapel never asked again. There is a truth buried there, beneath the hymns and sermons. A truth older than the town itself, etched into the very foundations of its church. This story is not found in history books. It exists in fragments, in discarded letters, in censored articles, in the confessions of the broken few who lived long enough to whisper. Tonight, we open those doors. We step into the silence of those halls, and we ask the question no one dared to. What really happened to the children of St. Vincent's Orphanage? The year was 1893. The town of Ashcroft, North Carolina, barely scratched on the railroad lines, existed as little more than a name on a county map. Surrounded by pine forests and marshland, it was a place where secrets could breathe freely, where silence carried more weight than words. At the center of Ashcroft stood St. Vincent's Orphanage, a red-bricked building raised by the church after the Civil War. Its spire cut through the sky like a warning finger, visible for miles. To outsiders, it was a beacon of hope in a wounded nation. The church boasted of its mission, feeding the hungry, educating the fatherless, offering salvation to those who had nothing. But Ashcroft was not a town of questions. Poverty bred obedience. Religion demanded silence. The sermons of Father Alcott, the man who ran both the orphanage and the parish, echoed in every ear. Children are clay. Clay must be shaped. Clay must be broken if it resists. Behind the stone walls of St. Vincent's, the days followed a rigid pattern. Dawn bells, prayer, meager meals, then work, always work. The children scrubbed, stitched, and labored, their small hands bleeding, their eyes downcast. Locals told themselves this was discipline, a righteous path. No one asked why their laughter was never heard outside the gates. The town's graveyard grew during those years. The headstones bore names no one recognized. Small crosses marked only with initials. Some whispered they belonged to orphans who fell ill, but the number of deaths never matched the number of recorded burials. And still the trains passed Ashcroft without stopping. The world looked away. Ashcroft belonged to its church, and the church belonged to its secrets. By daylight, St. Vincent's Orphanage was the pride of Ashcroft. Its red brick facade gleamed in the sun, its tall windows reflecting the illusion of purity. Travelers passing through spoke of its orderliness, its grandeur compared to the crumbling shacks of the town. The children were paraded on Sundays, dressed in clean but threadbare uniforms, lined up in pews as Father Alcott delivered fiery sermons about discipline and salvation. To the congregation, the sight was moving. Orphans turned into obedient lambs, proof of God's grace. Letters sent to benefactors in Raleigh and Richmond described smiling faces, warm meals, and scripture lessons. These letters, carefully penned by hand, carried no hint of the bruises, the hunger, or the long hours of forced labor. They spoke of charity, never of punishment. Visitors were shown the chapel, the classrooms, the neat rows of beds. They were not shown the cellar, nor the locked room at the end of the east wing, nor the narrow stairway that led beneath the chapel. Father Alcott, tall and gaunt with a commanding voice, carried himself as a man of unwavering piety. His words dripped with authority, convincing the townsfolk that every hardship inside the orphanage was necessary for shaping the children's souls. Beside him was Sister Miriam, a woman cloaked in black habit, her pale eyes colder than the grave. She was the enforcer of silence, the one who punished whispers, who carried the keys to every door. To the townspeople, they were saviors. To the children, they were wardens. Yet even those who believed the illusion could not ignore the shadows that lingered around St. Vincent's. The bells never rang at night, yet faint cries sometimes drifted across the marshland. And each spring, when the ground thawed, fresh crosses appeared behind the chapel, always small, always unmarked. The mask of respectability held firm, but beneath it, something ancient was stirring. It began with a boy named Elias. He was 9 years old, thin as a shadow, with a stubborn streak that the sisters despised. Unlike the others, Elias did not bow his head when told. He did not weep when struck. He asked questions about his mother, about the graves behind the chapel, about why the older children sometimes vanished overnight and never returned. On a cold November morning in 1894, Elias was gone. His bed, neatly made, looked untouched. His belongings, what little he had, remained folded at the foot of the mattress. The children whispered that he had been taken below. The official story spread quickly. Elias had run away. Father Alcott told the congregation that the boy was ungrateful, that Satan had guided his feet into the wilderness. He preached, "That rebellion leads only to ruin." The townsfolk nodded, accepting the tale without question. But the children of St. Vincent's knew better. They remembered the night before, when Sister Miriam had led Elias down the East Wing's stairwell. They remembered his eyes, defiant, unblinking, as the door slammed shut behind him. He was never seen again. Weeks later, faint scratching was heard beneath the chapel floor during evening prayers. At first, the children dismissed it as imagination, but the sound grew louder, sharper, like fingernails clawing against stone. The sisters silenced anyone who dared to mention it. By spring, a new wooden cross appeared behind the chapel. No initials, no name, just a small, uneven grave, as if dug in haste. The other children learned the lesson well. Questions were dangerous. Defiance was fatal. And yet, some whispered that Elias had not died at all, that he lingered in the walls, in the tunnels beneath the orphanage, waiting for the night the truth would break free. Ashcroft was a small town. Nothing went unnoticed for long. And yet, when Elias vanished, no one asked too many questions. A farmer's wife swore she saw a child's figure moving in the marshes at dusk, barefoot and trembling. But when she raised the matter in town, she was told she must have seen a stray dog. Another man recalled hearing faint wails carried by the wind on a Sunday night, but Father Alcott's sermon the following morning silenced his doubts. "The devil mimics voices," the priest declared. "He tempts your ears to turn you against God's house." Still, the whispers spread. Mothers who had left their children at St. Vincent's began to look uneasy. They asked quiet questions. Why were letters from their sons and daughters so rare? Why did the children's faces seem gaunter each month during Sunday processions? Why were the graves multiplying? The answers came swiftly and brutally. A shopkeeper who questioned the orphanage's mortality rate found his business boycotted after Father Alcott denounced him from the pulpit. A widow who pleaded for her daughter's release was forced to kneel in the chapel for 12 hours as punishment for her doubt. Even the town's sheriff, a man bound by faith more than law, was said to have visited the orphanage one winter's night. The next morning, he claimed there was nothing to investigate. His silence was bought not with money, but with something far more binding: fear. The whispers never stopped, but they never grew loud enough to be heard. In Ashcroft, silence was survival. And so, parents kept delivering their children. The town kept attending its sermons. The bells of St. Vincent's kept tolling, but beneath the hymns the scratching never ceased. At St. Vincent's, discipline was not enforced only with the rod. It was carved into the very bones of the place. The children were woken by the tolling of the orphanage bell at 4:30 a.m. sharp. If one child failed to rise in time, all were punished. Breakfast was nothing more than thin porridge, sometimes moldy bread. Afterward, hours of scrubbing floors, mending clothes, and carrying water filled their days. Even prayers became a form of labor, recited until throats burned, repeated until the words lost meaning. Father Alcott called this breaking the will of sin. But to the children it was something else. Erasure. Symbols reinforced obedience. Everywhere. Above every doorway hung iron crucifixes blackened with age. The chapel walls bore murals of angels whose faces seemed too stern, their eyes unblinking, almost accusatory. And at the center of the altar stood a chalice, silver, ornate, never touched except by Father Alcott. Rumors said it was older than the church itself, brought across the ocean generations ago, a relic used in rituals the children were never allowed to see. Sister Miriam wielded her ring of keys like a weapon, each one clanging against her belt, each one a reminder that freedom was locked away. She moved soundlessly through the halls, her footsteps swallowed by the stone, her presence as suffocating as a shadow. The townspeople, too, lived under symbols of control. Father Alcott's sermons were laced with warnings. Disobedience was rebellion against God. Doubt was heresy. Silence was salvation. His words infected their homes, their meals, their very thoughts. Through crosses, bells, keys, and scripture, St. Vincent's built a cage no one dared to question. And yet, symbols can be misread. Some children claimed the murals moved at night. Others swore the crucifixes dripped. Perhaps the walls themselves resisted the silence. The greatest cruelty of St. Vincent's was not the hunger, nor the lash of Sister Miriam's cane. It was the way the orphanage rewrote the minds of its children. The youngest ones forgot their parents' names within months. They learned not to cry when punished, because tears invited more punishment. Their laughter, once bright, became brittle and nervous, like a sound borrowed from someone else. Obedience was not demanded, it was engineered. Each child who resisted vanished, leaving behind only an empty bed, a fresh cross, or a silence too heavy to ignore. The message was clear. Survival meant surrender. And yet the submission was never enough. Father Alcott preached that sin was hereditary. He told the children they carried the darkness of their parents, drunkards, prostitutes, criminals, etched into their blood. To be saved, they had to be broken, reshaped, made pure through suffering. Over time, the children began to police themselves. They reported whispers. They corrected each other's prayers. They recited scripture in their sleep, their voices cracked and hoarse. It was as though the orphanage had planted a second voice inside their heads, one that never ceased, one that always demanded more. The townsfolk were no different. Many of them had once been children at St. Vincent's themselves. They carried the same scars, the same fear of questioning. They passed it on to their own families. Silence at the dinner table, discipline without reason, a dread of authority so deep it lived in their bones. It was not just an orphanage. It was a factory of obedience, a place where trauma was not an accident, it was tradition, and trauma, once planted, does not die. It grows, it adapts, it waits. The children of St. Vincent's did not escape their inheritance. They became its messengers. Behind St. Vincent's Chapel lay a patch of land that the townsfolk called God's Acre. From a distance, it looked peaceful. Rows of crosses, a scattering of weathered stones, weeds growing tall between them. But anyone who walked among those graves felt it. The wrongness. The air was heavy, too still, as if the earth itself resented what had been forced into it. The graves were small, too small. Many were unmarked, bearing only crude wooden crosses without names. A few had initials, but the letters were carved hastily, unevenly, as though the engraver had been rushed. And the number of graves, it never matched the official records. By 1896, parish reports listed only 7 child deaths from illness. Yet the cemetery held more than 24 fresh mounds. Some graves appeared overnight, the soil still damp with dew, no witnesses to their digging. The children whispered that burials took place after midnight, when the bell tolled once and Sister Miriam walked the yard with a lantern. A farmer's son, sneaking through the marsh, once swore he saw a line of children carrying something wrapped in burlap toward the graveyard. Their faces were blank, their steps robotic. The next morning, he told his father. That very night, the boy fell ill and died before dawn. His death was written off as fever. Those who lived near God's acre reported sounds, muffled cries, soft scratching, a hollow knocking that rose from the ground when the moon was high. The soil seemed restless, as if something beneath still struggled to breathe. But when questions were asked, the answer was always the same. God takes who He wills. We are not to question His plan. And so the graves multiplied. Silent, anonymous, endless. The first confession did not come from a child. It came from a woman who had worn the black habit for more than 20 years. Her name was Sister Agnes. Pale, thin, her hands twisted with arthritis, she had long been a silent presence. At St. Vincent's, never cruel but never openly kind either. She obeyed. She watched. She endured. Until the weight of what she had witnessed began to crush her from the inside. One evening in 1897, she asked to speak privately with Mrs. Calloway, a widow who had once entrusted her son to the orphanage. They met in the back pew of the chapel after Vespers when the rest of the town had gone home. With trembling lips, Sister Agnes whispered words that had never been spoken aloud. Not all the children are buried because of illness. Some are taken, chosen, and it is not God's hand that strikes them down. Her voice broke as she described the rituals beneath the chapel, the locked cellar, the chalice that Father Alcott alone touched, the children led below and never returned. She claimed the deaths were not accidents, but sacrifices, part of a covenant older than the orphanage itself. Mrs. Calloway listened in horror. For years she had doubted, but now the confirmation was too much to bear. She promised to tell others. She promised the truth would not die in silence. But within days, Sister Agnes was gone. The church claimed she had left Ashcroft to join another convent in Virginia. No letters ever arrived. No convent claimed her. And Mrs. Calloway? A week later, her home caught fire in the middle of the night. She and her 2 remaining children perished in the flames. The town grieved. Father Alcott preached about God's mysterious will. But the whispers deepened, because some secrets cannot be buried without the earth itself spitting them back. After the death of Mrs. Calloway and the disappearance of Sister Agnes, something in Ashcroft shifted. The whispers did not stop, but they changed. No longer were they questions. They became warnings. Don't ask. Don't look. Don't bring it up again. The town had made its choice. St. Vincent's was more than an orphanage. It was the town's foundation. Farmers supplied it with food. Local carpenters repaired its walls. Seamstresses stitched its uniforms. The church's reputation drew donations from wealthy patrons in distant cities. Without the orphanage, Ashcroft would collapse into dust. So, when children vanished, when fresh crosses appeared, when faint cries echoed at night, the people trained themselves not to hear, not to see. not to remember. Father Alcott reinforced this silence from the pulpit. His sermons grew harsher, his eyes sharper. He told his flock that questioning the church was no different than questioning God himself. Doubt, he warned, was the root of all damnation. He preached that those who whispered lies would burn not only in hell, but bring plague and ruin upon the town. Fear became the air Ashcroft breathed. The widow who asked too much lost her home in a fire. The shopkeeper who challenged the orphanage saw his business destroyed. A farmer's wife who wept too loudly for her missing daughter was found drowned in the marsh, her death called an accident, and yet behind closed doors, parents wept into their pillows. Husbands and wives argued in hushed tones. Children were told never to wander near St. Vincent's after dark, though no one explained why. It was a pact of silence, spoken by none, enforced by all. Ashcroft had become a town built on fear, a town where survival meant complicity, and St. Vincent's kept its doors open, its spire rising like a blade against the sky. In 1901, a young clerk named Samuel Brant was assigned to assist with church bookkeeping. He was not a pious man, only a boy in need of wages. His job was simple: copy names into ledgers, account for donations, maintain neat records of births, deaths, and burials. But Samuel had a habit of reading what he copied, and it was in those ledgers that he noticed the first cracks. The death records did not match. For every illness listed, there were twice as many graves behind the chapel. Some names appeared once in the ledger, then vanished altogether, as if the children had never existed. In other places, Samuel found entries written not in English but in Latin, cramped between the margins. Words like hostia, offering. Words like renovatio, renewal. One ledger contained only initials alongside strange symbols. Circles. Within circles, crosses inverted. Numbers arranged in patterns that made no sense to him. At the top of the page, in Father Alcott's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "The covenant is maintained." Samuel, frightened but curious, began to copy fragments of these hidden entries into his own notebook. He kept it secret, tucked beneath a loose board in his attic room. But secrets do not stay buried long in Ashcroft. One evening, he returned to find his room ransacked, the board pried loose, the notebook gone. He asked no questions. He told no one. But within a month, Samuel Brant was dead, struck down, they said, by a sudden fever. The church buried him quickly, no ceremony, no record. His name vanished from the rolls. But decades later, fragments of his notebook resurfaced, smudged pages, torn and incomplete. Enough to prove one thing: St. Vincent's had always kept two sets of records, one for the world and one for itself. When the first toll of the seminary bell rang that evening, the town thought nothing of it. Bells were meant to call, to gather, to announce the passing of hours. But when the toll continued, long after it should have ended, the air itself seemed to tighten. Witnesses said the sound did not come from bronze and iron, but from somewhere deeper, like bones being struck against hollow wood. The children of the town cried without knowing why. Men covered their ears, only to find the sound burrowed beneath skin and marrow, vibrating in places no human should feel. Father Abel insisted it was the signal of divine warning, but his voice quivered as he said it. The sisters gathered in the chapel, hands clasped, prayers tumbling from their mouths faster than thought. Yet even as the words left their lips, the air seemed to grow colder, sharper, and then came the smell, a coppery sweetness that lingered too long in the back of the throat, as though blood itself was misted into the wind. No one admitted it aloud, but they all remembered the stories whispered about the bell, that it was cast from stolen metals, melted from locks, shackles, and rings once worn by those who had vanished, that it bore within its alloy the memory of suffering, and that each strike awakened it. When at last the toll ceased, silence did not return. The silence was replaced with whispers, faint, almost inaudible, yet clear enough to call names. Names of townsfolk, names of the forgotten, names of children that should never have been remembered. The people of Fair Hollow did not sleep that night, for every time they closed their eyes, they dreamed not of heaven or rest, but of the bell rope tightening around their own throats. When construction crews cleared land for a new highway outside Wells Creek in 1937, they stumbled upon something chilling, a cluster of small coffins buried just beneath the roots of ancient pines. The boxes were crude, hastily nailed together, and inside each lay the remains of children no older than 10. The newspapers, briefly, covered it. Old cemetery unearthed, possibly orphan victims of influenza. Before moving on, but locals whispered a darker truth. These were not plague victims. They were offerings. The townspeople knew of a children's choir that once sang at St. Eloria's during the 1870s. Their angelic voices were paraded at festivals, funerals, and even political events, giving the church prestige and money. But behind closed doors, the children were beaten, drugged, and, when their voices faltered, discarded. Some said they were buried alive, their faint cries echoing in the chapel's wooden rafters until silence swallowed them whole. Those who examined the bones in 1937 noticed something the papers never reported: deep scratches inside the lids of the coffins, tiny fingernails broken down to the quick, skulls that bore hairline fractures as if small heads had been slammed against walls. One medical examiner noted in a sealed letter, "These were not victims of disease. They fought, they suffered, they were silenced." That letter was never published, hidden away in state archives. After the discovery, construction workers reported strange happenings on the site. Machinery broke down, clocks stopped at the same hour, 3:14 a.m., and at night, voices rose from the soil. Children's lullabies sung in broken harmony. Families in town began locking their doors earlier, claiming they saw pale, barefoot figures wandering the highway embankments, their mouths open in silent song. The coffins were quietly removed and reburied elsewhere under state order. But, to this day, no one will say exactly where. Wells Creek learned the price of speaking too much truth. Some secrets, it seemed, were meant to stay buried, along with the children who were never allowed to grow old. The deeper the archives go, the less they resemble records and more they resemble scripture. The text shifts from neat clerical handwriting to scrawled symbols burnt into the margins, lines intersecting like the veins of a spider's web. The diary speaks of the Feast of Renewal, a ritual performed not in churches but beneath them, under the earth where no light could follow. Witnesses describe narrow tunnels that opened into a cavern lined with limestone and bones. There, the elders gathered in robes, whispering hymns not to God, but to something older, something for which God was only a mask. They took children from the orphanage, from the poorhouses, from the fields where no one would come searching, and beneath the hymnals and the psalms, a drumbeat rose, an echo of something primal, predating the town itself. The ceremony was not sacrifice in the traditional sense. It was assimilation. The victims were drugged with laudanum, their minds clouded, their bodies malleable. Their final prayers were not spoken, but drawn in blood, etched into the floor of the cavern. The priests would drink the silence that followed. No one spoke of what came after, only that the soil beneath the church seemed fertile in ways it should not have been. Crops flourished. Families prospered, and still the graveyards swelled, with names. The diaries grow frantic here, words scratched as though the writer's hands trembled. They speak of shadows moving against the cave walls, forms that did not belong to any human body. They speak of voices whispering back from the dark, voices that remembered every prayer, every child, every secret buried in the ground. The townspeople called it salvation. The writer called it damnation. When the final papers were sealed and the graves refilled, life in Ashford continued, at least on the surface. A new pastor replaced the disgraced Reverend Galloway, the seminary reopened under a different name, and the orphanage once again filled with children whose cries echoed through its narrow halls. To outsiders, the town seemed to recover, its wounds hidden beneath the plaster of progress and polite smiles. But for those who knew, for those who had seen what was unearthed, there was no healing, only silence. Locals whispered that the ground itself had grown restless. Plows broke more often, crops soured unexpectedly, and wells turned bitter. Mothers hushed their children when they asked about the strange figures sometimes glimpsed at dusk near the riverbank, pale faces that vanished when approached. The town council dismissed it all as folklore, but every family carried a private dread they dared not speak aloud. And then, as if to ensure the story would never be forgotten, certain children began waking from sleep with words on their lips. Phrases, in a language they had never learned, names of people buried decades earlier. Some scribbled drawings of symbols carved into the chapel stone, symbols they could not possibly have seen. The adults tore up the drawings, punished the children, and prayed harder than ever, but the echoes would not stop. Ashford became a place where truth and myth dissolved into one another, where silence was the only shield. Those who knew chose to never speak, and those who guessed chose to never ask. But in the hush between church bells and in the shadows that stretched long over the orphanage lawn, one thing was certain. The past had not ended. It had only been buried, waiting. And if you stand in Ashford today, they say, and listen closely as night settles in, you'll hear it too, the faint scratching beneath the earth, the restless hum of voices that were never meant to be silenced. The final records of the New Hope Orphanage were never officially sealed, yet they may as well have been. The institution's name was erased from maps, its property sold off in secret auctions, and its history buried beneath newer foundations. What little documentation survived lies scattered in forgotten courthouse basements, or inside dusty boxes locked away in university archives no one is permitted to access. And yet, despite every effort to erase it, the silence remains louder than any record. Locals whisper of children's laughter echoing across the empty fields on windless nights. Travelers report the faint chiming of bells, though no church stands within miles. Farmers claim the soil near the site refuses to yield crops, as if poisoned, not by chemicals, but by memory itself. The town of Black Hollow learned to live with its silence, but it has never escaped it. Families who prospered after the orphanages collapse carry guilt like an heirloom, passing it down from one generation to the next. The descendants of those who tried to expose the truth remain marked, forever watched by shadows that coil in the corners of their homes. The story of New Hope is not merely about a building, or even the children who disappeared within its walls. It is about the systems that let it breathe, the churches and courts that closed their eyes, the families who benefited from looking away. It is about how evil does not always roar. It often whispers, slowly weaving itself into the structure of community until no one can tell where it ends and where survival begins. And so the silence endures. Because what was buried was not just the truth of a place, but the proof that some wounds in America's history were never meant to heal.